I will say, even as an art student, I was never trained to think about it like this. I heard language around you're teaching people how to see, you're teaching people how to think, you're teaching people how to connect to their emotions. And I think those are all pieces of it. But what I've gotten really fascinated by is if I'm guiding somebody, if I'm literally leading somebody to something, what am I leading people toward? And then the communication piece, like your medium, starts becoming, how am I doing that? And I really think most artists are not conscious that they're leading people to things.
Welcome to the Be Unbound Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And we have a return guest, which is always fun. Sarah Shaw was here previously, but now she's back with a fun announcement. Unbound is about to, has released, I should say, for the coming year, an art track, and so a specialty track inside of our Ascend program. And Sarah has agreed to be the person who leads that and sets that up. And if you don't know, Sarah has some really interesting both experience as an artist. She makes her living doing graphic work and visually interpreting things, but also has some really intriguing ideas about art that we have benefited from talking to her in the past about and looking forward to having her talk to our students about. And in this conversation, we get into some of that, including the very controversial, very interesting recent portrait of King Charles. So hopefully that'll interest you enough to stick with us. This is not a commercial for our track. It's more of a discussion of art. So if you're interested in the track, please stay because we'll be happy to tell you about it. But if you're interested in art, and especially how art speaks to the culture and this time and age, then I think you'll find this conversation interesting. Sarah Shaw, welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. We're delighted to have you again. We were just sitting here laughing and joking, telling stories. David and I were just at an Unbound wedding. Many of you will know the folks that were married. Abe, who used to be the co-host of the Be Unbound podcast, married Abby in South Dakota. David and I both had various adventures getting there, and so we had all kinds of wild stories to tell. It was a wonderful wedding. Abe and Abby, if you listen to this, congratulations again. It was a beautiful wedding, and it was worth all the effort it took for us to get there. And we were delighted and honored to be a part of it. So we were just trading stories about that. Sarah came with her prerequisite technical difficulties, which we've already banished because David's cool like that. And so, Sarah, we have some fun stuff to talk about. And this is going to be a discussion that has to do with one of the new tracks that Unbound is offering this year. So we are offering a video track, a writing track, and specifically an art track. And Sarah is in charge of the art track and is the head instructor as well as coordinator of that. But before you tune out and think this is going to be one long commercial, we do want to tell you about the art track. But in the process, we want to talk to you about why we did an art track in the first place. And I specifically want to talk about Sarah's kind of take and perspective on art, because this is the reason that we added it. So let's start with this. We added these tracks for a couple of reasons. One, they were in demand. So at the end of the day, it's really helpful if you want to add tracks that students get engaged in, that you add tracks that students want. And so there's definitely a practical element to this.
We like to think that we're good enough at business to recognize, hey, people want this. We should give it to them.
That's right. And so especially if we're going to charge money for it, it makes sense to do things people want. But there's a broader element here in that all three of us have a deep, I might even say fierce passion for changing culture. And we have a little bit of an interesting perspective on that because we do not believe that changing culture happens through changing residents on Air Force One. We don't think changing culture will happen particularly quickly. We don't think a lot of the traditional power plays about changing culture, not that we think they're unimportant, we still think they're a real critical thing. We think that you change culture by telling better stories. And we also think that Christians in particular have a better source for telling good stories than anybody else for obvious reasons, in our opinion. And you tell good stories through writing, certainly writing stories. You tell good stories through visual mediums. That's why we had the video track. But at the heart of both of those, you tell good stories by having better art. And we think that there's a intersection here where we think that there's a deficit of good art in the world. We also think that there's a deficit of understanding how to make art in a way that is sustainable. And with that, enter Sarah. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about why you answered a crazy call and said, hey, we got this wild idea, and you didn't need much convincing. You were like, I'm in. And so tell us about what you're in for.
Yeah, no, I was in. It was really funny. I mean, they technically asked, and I was like, yeah, I'm already in. Like, I already signed. I signed a blank piece of paper. I signed all the things.
That is pretty true.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm fascinated in it. I got in Unbound, interestingly, in some ways, kind of because of art. So I was doing fine art in high school. And I mean, I've gone into my story last time I was on here and everything, but I won't give that away. But I did have my art teacher in high school tell me he had been through a traditional art program, he had done illustration, and he basically just watched me do my stuff for about a few months. And then he was like, hey, you could be a professional artist. And then I was like, cool, like what art school? And he's like, don't do art school, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. I was like 15 or 16. I was like, I thought if you wanted to do art, like 1 + 1 = 2, boom, this is what you're supposed to do, right? And he just was like, you can teach yourself art and you should actually go get a business degree. Because at least at the time, I think he went through school in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of business options. Like now they'll include a class, and I won't speak for traditional art programs. People I think are doing more with that, realizing it's a need. But that's actually, I heard that. I latched onto it when I started with Unbound. I was originally doing entrepreneurship. I just switched it over to organizational leadership later because I liked doing more courses about people than accounting. That's all it was. It was
I
accounting
feel
too.
that.
Yeah. Got out of accounting too, everybody, for change management. I was like, yeah, this is a win. So, but it was funny. Like I was doing just business skills and leadership. And then with organizational leadership, there's heavier emphasis on communication. And I have found it really interesting now running my own graphic design business and everything and we can jump more into this, but that has been such a secret. I hate to say weapon in a way, because that sounds more violent than I mean, but it has been a huge differentiating factor. Like I've had clients tell me like, hey, you're like a pleasant artist, which is a very interesting statement to get. And me being me, I'm very curious. I've pulled up people a little bit with that. Like, oh, what do you mean? And then they're like kind of startled. And then I did finally have someone go like, well, you can just like, communicate. And I was like, there we go. That's really interesting. But I love art and creativity for itself. But what I am really passionate about too is like Jonathan, you said that culture is shaped by creativity. It's shaped by the arts. And I think sometimes that can obviously be for good. And in other times, it ends up being kind of destructive. And then you have to kind of rebuild and everything. So I'm very curious and driven to, with my own work, see it as shaping culture. And then also very curious about how to help shape others as they're stepping into their respective mediums of art. They might be into audio, they might be into pottery, they might be into there's so many different things you can do, but just really equip them. Like you hit the ground running. And what are some of those skills that you need?
So, Sarah, we can take this a couple different directions, but both of you, I believe, have seen the recent portrait of King Charles. And Sarah, we just looked at it together recently.
Mhm.
And so, Sarah, you and I had an interesting experience. So, this does run deep and Unbound. Many years ago, prior to us actually taking over the company, I ran an event for the predecessor company to Unbound that was called the Great Art Project. And we did some really cool things there, and some of the genesis of the things that we're talking about happened there. But one of the things that happened is that we had students who, by and large, came from a Christian worldview, who had what they thought was a very sophisticated conversation about whether you could determine whether art was good or not. And I say sophisticated because I'm smiling a little bit because it is a very, how do I say this? It's a popular conversation to think that it's sophisticated, that art is good. And most young people will say art is all in the creator and beholder and all that stuff. Now, if you've seen the portrait of King Charles, and listeners, if you haven't, I would suggest that you quickly look at it. The question is, Sarah, is that good art?
This is like being on a talk show, it feels like at this moment. Gosh. Okay, my nerdy answer is it would depend on your perspective of art, just because like it's a worldview thing. That's the other thing people don't really realize often with art is how often worldview is playing into it. And sometimes it's a coherent worldview, and sometimes it's just sort of a mismatch of almost like a buffet. I could imagine if the artist of this painting, and I haven't read about it, but I could imagine if their view was, I'm getting my inner expression out, right? Like this is my view. I'm also curious if this is that take, because I'm like, why is he in a waterfall of Kool-Aid? What what inner thing are you expressing with that? Just curious. So I would expect to see this at least in our art museum, 1,000%. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and something like that, they would actually even put it in. This might sound strange to people, but they wouldn't put that probably in the modern section. They might put it among other like European art and everything, and they would just consider it an evolution of art. I was trained by my art teacher. I really like what they would call realism, where you're trying to make painting as much like a photograph as possible. And so I I feel like at least the way that portraits have been done typically of the monarchy, it leans that direction, sometimes with thicker strokes and everything. So I that's a roundabout answer. I think it does qualify as art. I am curious mostly what they're trying to communicate with going with a different style, because it breaks tradition.
Well, that would be I don't I'm certainly gonna sit here and say that this is an amateur attempt at art or something. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously it takes some skill to create that. Now that but I think that the thing that is interesting to me is that it appears to me that it is a portrait that was painted, and perhaps it was, and maybe that makes it worse in some of the ways. It was painted without a purpose. Portraits of the monarchy in the past have been for records, right? For subsequent generations to see and gauge some of the character and the thing that that monarch wanted to present, and the way that he or she wanted to be remembered for future generations. Now, it's quite possible that King Charles was in on this, and there is
Mhm.
something very interesting about him, maybe what he wants to present there. But I think the interesting point here is that we live in a culture which just says art is art. And
Mhm.
there's a level of it's art if I claim that it's art. And I would say that a Christian worldview says that no, at some level, art is delivering a message of some kind.
Mhm.
And that what kind of message is being delivered is actually quite important.
Mhm.
And that would be where I'd kind of ask you, if you're talking about an art track and you're talking about what you want people to know about art, talk a little bit about that idea that art communicates something. And what is it that art ought to communicate? And clearly,
Mhm.
we're not talking about a specific, it can only communicate this one thing, but give us a little bit of perspective and a little bit of depth on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this just this week, and I'm going to actually change up your question a little bit and take it up further. I think that art leads people. So I've been playing around with this idea that it's a little bit more like if you are an artist, you are a guide of some kind. You're trying to take somebody somewhere. And we don't typically, I will say, even as an art student, I was never trained to think about it like this. I heard language around you're teaching people how to see, you're teaching people how to think, you're teaching people how to connect to their emotions. And I think those are all pieces of it. But what I've gotten really fascinated by is if I'm guiding somebody, if I'm literally leading somebody to something, that's a piece of the question is what am I leading people toward? And then the communication piece, like your medium, starts becoming how am I doing that? And so there's a lot to unpack there. And I really think most artists are not conscious that they're leading people to things. Does that make sense? Like it's not on the radar.
Mhm.
I just want to make
Yes.
pretty things. And I think too, it doesn't always have to be super deep reflection. Like if you are just making pies or you're in culinary arts, that might feel different than, oh, I'm making this documentary about a cultural thing. I think there's just a difference sometimes between that piece of like, what am I leading people toward if you're creating art, say for a political documentary. And there is something very meaningful if you own the bakery and your goods bring people joy on their Saturday mornings and it's family outings and everything. And so, and I think within the scope of everything, it becomes a little bit dangerous to try to rank what's important as an artist to consider. But I would say, even from that spectrum of what people might consider importance or this shapes culture, that most of us are not thinking about. What am I leading people to?
Well, I think, Sarah, that there's a aspect here. A lot of artists don't think about what am I leading people to? And so consequently, if you don't think about your audience and who you're leading people to or your purpose, there is a level, I think you characterize it as making pretty things. There's sort of
Mhm.
self-centeredness to artistic expression where it's like, well, I'm expressing myself. And so therefore you should respect it because I'm expressing it.
Mhm.
But that misses the fact that, you haven't thought about the purpose of your art. You haven't thought about where it's taking people. And so therefore, it's tough for people to get emotionally engaged. And that leads us to the second big kind of stereotype of artist, which is the starving artist, right? So any kid who says they want to go to art school and the parents like, crud, I was hoping to raise a successful kid. I mean, there's this
Mhm.
element there. And I think there's some of that in a church here now where Christianity tends to be the realist in the room. We're the people that actually see
Mhm.
reality. And so you've got folks who say, well, we see reality. And the reality is you got a bunch of people who put urine in a jar and tape a banana to the wall and they consider that art. And in some weird parallel universe, people actually pay money for that. But that's very odd and it doesn't really work. And so I don't really think that this is a legitimate way to earn a living. I think there's a failure there, right? Because that means that kind of purposeful art that is deliberately designed to take somebody somewhere that is thought through, is now less accessible. It's more rare because we don't have folks who are trained and equipped to teach that. But those folks think, well, how do I make any money at this? Because the market is saturated with sort of self-centered, navel-gazing artists who aren't creating things that are emotionally engaging. All right, now having laid that all on the table, you've got a different opinion. You think that art should be purposeful, should lead some people somewhere, but you also think that a starving artist is a necessity. And so
Mm.
talk to us a little bit about, why is going into art, why is doing an art track an actual practical thing to do?
It's funny. My biggest hesitation in going into creative pursuits was the like, I don't want to do the starving artist thing, the scrambling artist thing. And another piece, I've been thinking about this as well, that a lot of creatives will say, like, you have to be on the edge of things or be a little bit of a loner so that you get the perspective, right? Like, this piece of perspective to then be able to speak into stuff. But I think, like, if we're to take the banana taped to the wall example, I think sometimes what goes a little bit haywire is artists will go to the edge, but then they're not really seeing that as, again, I would argue like a position of leadership with leading people places, not too far of a jump to say some leadership stuff is involved here, right? About how am I looking back on this group that I'm gazing at or looking at this issue and offering something valuable. And I think sometimes some of the starving artists, there's the nuts and bolts, right? Which can be like poor business skills, poor time management. I would also say relational skill sets are missing, working with clients, developing business, all that stuff. But I think sometimes too, what can happen is the artist goes out and they have this potential to be able to use that as a perspective to speak into something. But what they kind of end up doing is they create their own little world out here and demand people legitimize it, value it, boom, 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 boom. But then you get sometimes this art that you tilt your head at and you like, and I've heard other people say this, they'll look at something and be like, where is this person? Which is also kind of an interesting question because they're not really asking a geographical question, right? They're like, where is your mind? What's going on right now? And so I think when I think about something like the art track and what I really want to bring into it and challenge students is like, no, you do need to be able to have this perspective, but how do you attach it to loving people? I know you guys talk a lot about this, and I'd be curious to hear you elaborate on this connection, but it really is about people. And so when you get these spin-off loners that sometimes are even kind of vengeful with their art, they're actually angry at people. They're mad they're not understood. You can get some really manipulative or dark or just disconnected creativity that then doesn't generate an income because it's not attached to where people are.
You see this a lot in architecture. You have a lot of people say that, the most avant-garde or the most advanced architects often design buildings that nobody wants to live in. They're not designed for people. They're designed to make a statement. In architecture in particular, that's an expensive statement to make, when you make this kind of thing that is all your personal interpretation. And then you have people like, I don't want to work there, or I don't want to live there, or it's an uncomfortable place to be. And I think you can find the same thing with art. It's when you're right. We say in Unbound all the time and tasks only make sense in the context of relationships, which means that at the end of the day, you have to connect everything that you do to people, that it is ultimately people that matter. And so if you create art in the absence of that, and it's a expression of your own opinions or your own inner turmoil, then it's not that it can't have skill, and it could frankly move people who relate to you, but it also takes out this important element where it's very self-centered. And I think that's a lot of modern art today, is that kind of thing, that maybe it is meaningful to tape a banana to a wall for that particular artist, but it's a leap of logic to think that that has the same kind of personal impact on everybody else, or it's an ironic impact, right? Versus if you were thinking about, where am I leading someone? Even that very statement, I'm leading someone, you talked about it as being a position of leadership. It's also a position that acknowledges that there is somebody else being led. This is not just a self-expression thing. This is, I'm creating for somebody. And I think that idea that we are creating art for someone, if you look at great Christian art, it was created for someone, and that someone was Jesus the Christ, was God. The cathedrals were built as an act of worship to God, and paintings were painted as an act of worship to God. And so there's an element there that great art, transcendent art, in my opinion, art that actually has an impact. And then by the same token, art that can be economically feasible because it does elicit a response in somebody, has to be art that acknowledges that other person. So to your point, if you're creating for someone, to lead someone, take somebody somewhere, it is both a purpose, then a telos to that, but it is also there's a relationship in that. There's a acknowledgement that it's for somebody else, that impacts somebody else. Well,
Yeah.
Sarah, you've got an opportunity here with both the art track, and we're excited about what will happen there, but also with this podcast. We've talked about this a couple different things, and I've led you on with some questions here, but let's give you the floor. What is it that you want people to know and understand about art that you're open to explore in this track, and that you just get a platform here to say, hey, when you think about artists, set aside the stereotypes for a moment, and when you think about art, and these are some of the things that you should be thinking about.
Gosh, there's 1,000 directions I could go with this, but I'll start with something that's come up more recently that I just want to toss out and would love your thoughts on too, Jonathan. I recently was just at a kind of networking event that was for artists. And I say it like that just because my day-to-day work in some ways with graphic design, and then also just speaking and teaching and stuff, in some ways that I feel like I straddle the worlds of the creative world and the business world. So this was like neat and tidy over in the creative zone, mostly oil painters, textile and stuff. And I remember walking in the room, and I had forgotten this, but my temperament is actually not a classic artist temperament, my personality. And so I brought kind of my business world hat into this room, and it didn't go terribly, to be clear. It was not a disaster, but there were some mismatches in conversation. And it reminded me that, like, I was interested as a kid in creativity. And so I pushed to go be in creative classes and everything. But I've actually never felt often like, and people that know me would be like, of course there's creatives. But my friends, my social groups, they've never actually been dominated by the classic posse of artists or something that sometimes you can see, or like will show up in movies or something like that. And one of the things I've been pondering and thinking about too is, with being creative or wanting to do creative things, there's a lot of pressure of either dressing a certain way. Right now it happens to be you're at the thrift store. That'll probably change in 5 years. Who knows? Or it might be you got to be punk, or you got to be goth, or you got to be this, or you got to be that. And I've just been laughing because I'm kind of sitting here and I'm like, okay, I'm objectively creative. And I ran this by my closest friends to get some thoughts on. And they both were like, yeah, you're creative, but you don't have a creative temperament. And so I had just been pondering that and thinking about that and wonder how many people are drawn to creative things, but because they might not fit the classic look or the cliches, they kind of don't really know what to do with it or might not pursue something even as much. If they're like, well, I'm kind of rational and I don't really know what to do with all this eyeliner going around. So maybe I should just stick to spreadsheet. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic because it can create an imposter syndrome.
Well, I think you asked my thoughts on that. And I think that maybe the way to wrap this up is to say, if you have that creative urge, if you have that desire to make things and to create things that are beautiful and that move people emotionally and that speak a message and say something that you think was worth saying and that takes people in the right direction, don't think that you have to fit some sort of stereotype of whatever is in your mind as the creative person to do that.
Mhm.
And then I think this art track is designed certainly for people who know deep down and has always known they want to be artists, but also for those who have this a desire to creatively express themselves or have this desire to just express themselves visually in some sort of medium, but they're not quite sure how to do that. To be clear,
Mhm.
Sarah's not going to come in and teach you how to paint, but she is going to come in and teach you and provide resources, and Unbound's going to work to say, let's take your gifts and show you how you can apply them rightly. And what I mean by that is not like there's a right and a wrong, but I mean more apply them effectively in a way that does speak to people, that does go someplace, that takes you someplace, and then enables you to continue to create stuff and to make things. And then would like all of you to both hear and be encouraged by this. This is a deep passion of ours, but we think it ought to be a deep passion for anybody listening as well. That if we want to regain the culture in some fashion, if we want to make a difference, if we want to create a situation where people can thrive, then we're going to have to do that by telling better stories. And that we of all people are well equipped to do that. But we're going to have to hone our skill, and we're going to have to be wise, and we have to work hard, and we're going to be creative, but we're also going to have to be sophisticated and do that in a way that allows us to be profitable so that we can continue to do those things. And that's the spirit, and that's the hope, and that's the desire of this track that Sarah has created and that we're already have students enrolled in. And if you're interested in that and that speaks to you, then give us a call and we'll be happy to give you some more details. You can also find more details at our website, beunbound.us. And if what Sarah says appeals to you or strikes a chord with you, you have an opportunity to spend a whole year listening to stuff that Sarah says and see where that will take you. So we don't know if that's an encouragement or a warning. So.
Exactly. Hey, it'll be a memory. No,
That's right.
It'll
It'll be an experience. So
it'll be great. I'm really bringing the best of what I got as an art student and then what I've learned over the years, stepping into entrepreneurship. We're pulling a little bit from my stint as a therapist, mental health world. We're going to have a good time and just have it really be a space to process and grow as an artist. If people want to know my teaching style, they should watch Robin Williams and Dead Poets Society. So
well, it's worth noting that Sarah has earned her living in a couple of different ways, and she has mentioned them, but she has always at some level made a living by visual art. And so this is not a theoretical class. This is a class very much practically taught by somebody who has used her ability to visually speak to people as a way to make money so she can continue to visually speak to people. And in fact, I have some of my artwork that is not up on my walls now as I'm transitioning to hopefully a new office, but will be in the new office. And so I already have some pieces that will be there and as representative of something that Sarah created that speaks to me as we look at it and as we think about these things. So thank you, Sarah. If you're interested in this stuff, make sure that you check out beunbound.us and the art track. And Sarah, we'll look forward to having you back again. I'm sure we'll have this continued discussion.
sounds good. Thank you, Jonathan. Looking forward to it.
All right, David. Well, King Charles made an appearance, and what we didn't show is that Sarah had actually not seen the portrait before, and so we actually paused and showed it to her because I thought it would be an interesting point of discussion. And David, tell the audience what her immediate reaction was.
I think she just said, "Oh." I think it was something along those lines. I forget what she actually said.
Yeah, so that was an interesting kind of immediate on the fly thing to do. But there is some interesting things to think about there in terms of, I think for me, the big takeaway was the whole art tells a message and you're taking somebody somewhere. And that implies two things, that you're taking somebody, so it's for somebody else. and somewhere. So there's a telos, there's a purpose to it. And as always, talking to Sarah makes me feel like I understand art a lot better than I typically do. And I thought this was an interesting conversation for that.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of tie that in and highlight the other tracks that we have as well is that art is one of the 3 tracks that we're offering. And I liked the tie-in that you talked about at the very beginning, is that our other tracks are really also about telling worthwhile stories that are for other people and that have a purpose. And so we just have our tracks that are all for the purpose of equipping young adults to be culture changers, to do that in just whatever medium that they happen to be interested in, whether that's art, as we talked about with Sarah, or whether that's with video or with writing. And so I just really think that that's a cool aspect of the Ascend program that we get to highlight even more now.
Well, at the heart, David, Unbound is about building creators, building producers, and not so much consumers. Now, to some extent, we're all consumers, and I'm not even saying that that's wrong. I just think that there's an easy trap to fall into where you're a consumer, where you're always passively accepting, you're not going out and creating. And I think our kind of heart for what we do at Unbound and what we teach students is to go out and be a creator. To be made in the image of God is to at some level be a creator, somebody who produces and makes things. And that comes in a lot of different fashions. So we have a lot of students in Unbound who are interested in business. And so that's creating economic activity. But we also have a lot of people who are interested in art, and those things go together. You heard Sarah say that, her art teacher said, go major in business. And that is so that you can figure out how to create stuff that people want and that you can make a living doing. And at the heart of these tracks, these are all storytelling type tracks. We're about to add some business focused tracks as well, so stay tuned for that. But at the heart of this is, how do we train, equip, and connect people to community where they can tell better stories? And this may sound a little ridiculous, and maybe it is, but bear with me for a second. I fully expect that somewhere in these tracks are going to be the next culture-changing artists of our time. The Steven Spielbergs in the filmmaking track, the artists who will be on everybody's lips, 20 years hence, the people who write the next set of novels that becomes the new Narnia, the new Lord of the Rings. I don't claim that because I want to claim something famous or that I want that kind of prestige. I'm just saying that I have this deep passion and this deep interest, and all of us at Unbound share this, to equip and to train and to build the kind of people that have the potential to become that, and to tell those stories, not because we care about the prestige of them, but because we care about the impact those stories can have on a culture, on thinking of a next generation, of the inspiration, of giving hope. I think we've talked about this before, but our connection to the generation that is currently in high school and college is a connection that constantly says that we have a pandemic of hopelessness. And that's ironic in a time when I think there's lots of hope to be had. And at some level, the way you fix that is that you train artists and creators and writers and filmmakers who can tell stories of hope. And that's what we want to do. And if you want to be a part of that, go to beunbound.us to find more information. Better yet, schedule an appointment to talk to us and join us. And maybe you're the next author of Lord of the Rings, or the next producer of that film that everybody talks about, or the next person who creates a kind of art that takes somebody to a place of hope and a purpose. And that's what our hope here is today. So any last thoughts before we close this out, David?
Oh, man, you closed that beautifully. We love to be able to equip young adults with hope and with excitement for the future that they can be a part of, and be a part of a community that has those kinds of people with it. So I love it.
Excellent. Until next time, be unbound.